My name's Hedwig.
How old are you?
9?
I've never seen a case like this before. 23 identities live in Kevin's body. Who are you?
The Beast.
Today we're starting a podcast on the movie we saw recently. It's out now, SpLiT. If you haven't seen it, I guess this would be a spoiler, so maybe you should listen to this after seeing the movie SpLiT. SpLiT is a movie by Night Shyamalan, and it's about, we're going to go past through the movie a little bit, of a guy who has a dissociative identity disorder, meaning he's split. He has a lot of personalities, and he ends up abducting the three girls, and he hides them in his basement. We actually should explain more about this movie, about what happens to you when you are very traumatized, and especially when this is done at an early age. This is what happened to this guy. His name is Kevin, and he has several characters, but most of them don't know each other. They are not aware of each other. They can switch from one personality to another personality, and each of them has their own traits, their own gender. He visits this psychologist, which is the narrative of the story, and she knows that all these personalities need to come out. But there are three main characters in this guy, Kevin. Kevin, who is the initial person that was born, that one that was traumatized by his mother when he was really small. He is not there in the movie. He's basically guided and lived by two personalities. One is called Patricia, she's the mother type, and the other one is called Dennis, who surfaces actually during the movie, and he is the one who abducted these three girls. And then we're evolving into a 24th character of this personality, and this one is called the Beast.
Hey, pardon me, sir. I think you have the wrong car.
But we use these movies as a backdrop to show what is going on inside people, obviously. And what we've been seeing is that these movies have all been surrounding this whole project of trying to resurrect or connect to that core self. Jung would call it the archetype itself, meaning it's beyond the imagery and beyond all of that. So it would be beyond all of the illusions, and you would get to the core real self, which would be something outside of the limitations of space and time.
What the hell is going on?
All of these movies have been showing that the effort has been, there has been a confusion in this process in which the process has sort of been hijacked towards the resurrection of the bringing in of the sort of what we would call the anti-self, which would be at the collective level, the anti-Christ self, if you wish.
Don't worry. He's not allowed to touch you. He knows what you're here for. He listens to me. My name's Hedwig.
How old are you?
9?
And this goes back to the Übermensch of Hitler, or the Superman of Nietzsche. And what we're seeing is that all of these projects have been worked towards a splitting of the mind, a sort of a psychological CERN of splitting the atom. The self is the atom, towards the idea that if you split it up mean, enough, you would go beyond space and time, which is sort of why they say in CERN is like going beyond space and time and opening portals and all of that. The project we know now, often referred to as the MK Ultra, would be the psychological version of that, or the splitting up of the mind, to harness this super self. But what has not been realized up to now is that if this is done via the ever more splitting up of the mind, which in this movie is shown it's called SpLiT. And this person has been split in 23 alters that they access an upside down version of what Jung called the self. That it would be like the exact inverse of that, which would be like the anti-self. And here is the confusion, because the anti-self would technically not be any more part of the self. It's the absence of all self.
He's done awful things to people, and he'll do awful things to you. Someone's coming for you.
Who's coming?
The beast.
And it would not be part of the shadow anymore in terms of what is the unknown to the person, but it would be part of a darkness. So the beast in this movie represents not anymore a part of the person as such, but the sort of a resurrection of an anti-self, which is like this beast. This is where the therapists right at the moment don't understand this yet. There's no school of thought of psychotherapy that is aware of this yet. And that is reflected in the movie, in which the psychotherapist she presents her work at a conference in which she is sort of saying that this is basically like the secret for the future, meaning the unlocking of this supernatural self. But in the movie she is confused of whether it's another alter or it's just fantasy, because it's not in the classical alter. What she's seeing, what she didn't realize, is that this beast is basically indeed the anti-self. So it's not an alter, not a shadow alter. It's not a fantasy. So obviously in the movie she ends up being murdered by this beast figure. And what you see in the movie is that the core pair of opposites at the most extreme parts of themselves, which would be like this OCD guy called Dennis, and then this other woman, female version of himself, which should be like the female opposite. They are at the complete opposite extreme, unintegratable with each other, and they run the horde, which should be the whole vault of the altars, but they have sort of hijacked the horde and the host, the man himself, towards bringing in this beast, which they are either both of them are able to bring it in, because if they split it, they keep that split up. At the maximum of that split, the beast comes in, which is very interesting, because it's obviously they're showing that it's a sort of a Hulk figure, but that is they're showing that it's the superhero, but finally showing that it's the product of the complete fragmentation of the self. And that what we can get into a little bit later is that the big reveal is that is being shown that this process is being represented as the next step, in which people are sort of being conned into believing that this being sexually abused and traumatized would be the way to resurrect the Übermensch in themselves. While I'll stop here so you can get in, but while it's basically what we call in the movie is a sort of a vampire apocalypse being unleashed, because via the anti-self, the beast itself, which we find in Revelation 13, the dragon or the beast is being heralded in, but via the anti-selves. So we can speak of almost like of a collective possession taking place, which is what we see in Revelation as the apocalypse. The movie ends with this, where this beast that has been resurrected is called the Horde, but they show it on the backdrop of another one that was resurrected, which both are being portrayed as this superhero / psychotic killer. So it would not be a person as we know it in 3D, but it would be of the category of a sort of a demonic entity, which would be able to take over the person from the inside. The problem with this is that, often by Jung, in the time of Jung, they would interview him about the UFO phenomenon, and he did say that it was sort of related to the self archetype as an S, the self with the capital S. So these anti-selves would be sort of the equivalent, but then the whole other spectrum of reality. So coming in via the what I would call the lower collective unconscious, which is, if you look at movies like Pac-Man, then you will see that there is like this 3D merging with another dimension, which they often also portray as a virtual reality or so, a video game. But it would be coming in from the lower end, which now is associated with outer space. So if you look at the X-Men, mind you, the character that is playing SpLiT is the leader of the X-Men in the last X-Men, which is Professor Javier, which is Professor X. So that would be the leader, if you wish, of all of the X-Men, and the X-Men would be the anti-selves, which we find another version of in the movie Suicide Squad, for instance. And the Professor X, who is now playing Mr. SpLiT, called now the Horde, once he's been completely possessed by the beast. Right, all of this culture was to unleash, to give birth to the anti-self, which is like the inhabitant of the upside down grid. The anti-self is like what sustains the upside down grid. This is why in the movie this beast figure like walks on the walls like Spider-Man, which is always just shown in the movies and the dreams. Mind you, all of these movies are coming out of the dreams as to when the grid is inverted. So then you know you're dealing with the upside down grid, and then you know you're dealing this beast figure or the anti-self figure. They inhabit that upside down grid, which we call the dark grid. And this is not a grid. This is not dreams. This is a real world in which you can get lost in there, or you can fall asleep in it and never wake back up. But what we are witnessing is that at the entering of that grid into this world, this is why the beast figure cannot be killed with bullets, because he doesn't exist on this grid. And the culture of nihilism, sarcasm, and pain is all sort of like the anti-shadow work culture, which is all based on cutting off the shadow and going into dissociation. And cutting into that dissociation, the very cutting is very symbolic of the cutting off of the shadow and the pain, which is, it serves to note though that all of this is the upside down of a right side up version of all of this.
Yeah, exactly.
Because the nails of the crucifixion would be the true cutting, the true piercing, but that would come when we reach to the razor's edge by virtue of integrating the opposites. So so mind you, this upside down anti-self grid is the exact inverse of the right side up, not the opposite. This is why it's so confusing. And this is why, right, the culture is, every song a child is hearing nowadays, every movie, every video game, everything you're being taught at school is all grooming you. Grooming is another word for soft programming towards the unleashing of the anti-self. And it's not true that if you wish, that you have to be ritually abused in terms of the MK Ultra to be subject to this. You can also split yourself via standard abuse, just trauma, but then once this culture is taking them into that upside down grid. And then once you're in that, you see, Jung's work on dreams was so essential because he discovered the collective unconscious. But there is a dark collective unconscious. So when you go upside down because of splitting and this culture of anti-shadow work, which is you're getting it in from a child in every possible medium, then via the sleep state, people can be taken over and programmed into deeper versions of this guy we call SpLiT. We have to wake up to this, because when you hear that the shooters, like the Florida shooting, that this guy is claiming to be a programmed MK Ultra, and we are witnessing the apocalypse, the vampire apocalypse, in the sense that the anti-self is a vampire. So in the book of Revelation, the beast is called a vampire, and the kids are wanting to go into that culture now. We're noticing that the teenagers are all wanting to sort of, mimic this, imitate this vampire culture, and the Suicide Squad movie, is glorifying that this Joker figure is abusing this woman that is like the female Joker into becoming a anti-self, and it is glorified now that abuse can lead to this, and the children are imitating this wholesale. What we have not realized yet is that it is all a big Superman, Übermensch program, of which we saw the first glimpses of in Nazi Germany, in terms of this obsession with the Übermensch. And what we know is that this project obviously never died. It became more invisible and more all-encompassing, not only limited anymore to Nazi Germany, but has spread out over the whole world. So we will just leave it at this for now. Obviously, this is this in and of itself is a series of many more videos we have done. Also, in our research on the self and the self-development process, and where we have uncovered that there has been a horrible mistake made in confusing the shadow for darkness. This anti-self is a darkness entity, which, because it's the anti of the true self, is resurrected into the person as a self, as a part of the self, but it's not. It's just a sort of a, like you have matter and antimatter. It's an anti-vessel, which is then possessed by this antichrist figure. If you wish, then all of these anti-self figures would be more factually stated like clones of the central antichrist figure.
Because the dreams of people's dreams contain apprehensions, you know. But it is very difficult to say whether they point to a war, because that idea is uppermost in people's mind. Formerly, you know, it has been much simpler. People didn't think of a war. And therefore, it was rather clear what the dreams meant. Nowadays, no more so. We are so full of apprehensions, fears, that one doesn't know exactly to what it points. One thing is sure, a great change of our psychological attitude is imminent. That is certain.
Why?
Because we need more. We need more psychology. We need more understanding of human nature, because the only real danger that exists is man himself.